Yeah, thank you, Sandrine, and thank you for this very clear and very clear call to action. Also, after this sobering message, scientific message that we got in the previous section, it is maybe time to see what can be done, and in some cases for the cryosphere, what should be done. So if my slides can be put up, then I'm happy to lead you through what we have found in the last IPCC report, and also to try and explore a bit what we can understand under 50 by 30 pathways. Bottom line of this presentation is that it means that we are looking for pathways that have the near-term ambition to limit global warming to 1.5. Next slide, please. By now, we clearly know what needs to happen to halt global warming, and that means, and what needs to happen is that global emissions needs to be brought down to net zero. And the total amount of emissions that we emit until that time will determine the amount of global warming that we will see. That means we have a certain carbon budget that is left. And here on the right, you can see some of the updated numbers of the last IPCC report. If you put those in perspective, today we are emitting around 40 billion tons of CO2 per year, 40 gigatons of CO2, and then you can immediately see that the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, which is the limit at which the cryosphere starts to see real trouble, are very small. So how can these then be translated into pathways? Next slide, please. The IPCC 1.5 report looked at this question and here describes pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot. They have specific and very clear characteristics. In the next decade, by 2030, they all see a very robust declining trend in global carbon dioxide emissions. Emissions in 2030 are roughly 40 to 60% below 2010. The average of that is indeed 50% by 2030. When we then look further in the century, all these pathways also reach net zero CO2 emissions around mid-century, carbon neutrality as it is often referred to. Net zero greenhouse gases are achieved slightly later, about 2 decades later. This message has not gone unnoticed, and if we can go to the next slide, a recent study has inventorized all the announcement of net zero targets that have been put forward globally. By now, about 61% of global emissions are covered by net zero targets, about 68% of global GDP, and slightly more than half of the global population. These are really positive developments because these net zero targets really show us where an important milestone of this entire journey lays, and that is that we need to bring our global and national emissions down to zero. However, it's not all that rosy. When we want to get to net zero, we also need to start reducing, of course. And if we can go to the next slide, that is something that every year we look at in the United Nations Environment Programme's Emissions Gap Report. Every year we look at where emissions are heading and where they should be going to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And here on this slide, I show where current policies are currently heading in the blue, and then also where current pledges of countries are bringing us until 2030 in the orange and the red. And we don't need advanced mathematics to see that there is a really large discrepancy where current policies or current pledges are leading us until 2030 and where emissions should be in 2030 to be on a pathway for limiting warming to 1.5. Next slide, please. And this really means that there is an urgent need for 50 by 30 pathways. What are these pathways? These are 50 by 30 pathways are pathways that adequately contribute to lowering global emissions by 50% in 2030 relative to 2010 levels. These kind of pathways ensure that the near-term ambitions are in line with reaching net zero in the longer term. and they also ensure that the ambition in pursuit to limiting global warming to 1.5 is as high as possible. Over to my last slide then. Of course, the question is then, are these very stringent and ambitious reductions over the next decade feasible? The IPCC 1.5 degree special report was asked this question, and we looked into these questions and we came back with a maybe slightly more complicated answer. In the end, we identified 6 tick boxes that need to be ticked for us to be able to say that something is feasible. And if you can click 4 times, 4 of those tick boxes we as scientists can tick. We can say that within the laws of chemistry and physics, it's possible to limit warming to 1.5. We know that it's within the carrying capacity of our planet. We know that we have the technologies, and we know also that it doesn't cost the world to do it. However, it remains a question whether our societies will be able to the task to make the behavioral changes, and whether our political systems will show the political will to implement those stringent emission reductions that are needed. And if you click 1 last time, then there is, of course, for this, we as scientists, we need to look into society, to civil society, to governments, and to the COP at the end of this year to get an answer to see whether this is really feasible. Thank you very much.